Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Hare Krishna, it is muted. Your phone is muted. I cannot hear you.
Thank you, Raviji. Thank you. The 9th chapter starts out with some pretty heavy theology. Move over a bit so I can actually see you. Thanks, man. This idea that Krishna is everywhere and in everything, but is also simultaneously transcendental to everything. This idea that God is both immanent as well as transcendent. It's a fairly weighty idea in terms of theology. And it gets brought up in the 7th and 8th and in the 9th chapter. It's dealt with most elaborately in the 9th chapter. And Krishna does a little dexterous maneuvering because he has to explain how everything in the world is dependent on him, reliant on him, and under his direction. But if you go too far with that, you wind up in a deterministic world. And a deterministic world means that all the bad stuff that happens in the world is God's fault. So you want to create this sense of ownership where Krishna's all-powerful and in charge of everything, and not a blade of grass moves without his say-so. But if you take that literally, and somebody's absolutely omnipotent, then there's no room for free will. And so Krishna has to do this dancing, where he bounces back and forth between pointing out his sovereignness and his authority and his control, and then simultaneously his aloofness and his transcendence and his disinvolvement and his separateness from everything that's going on in the world. It's not difficult to, talk through. Maybe if you want to codify it for all time's sake, you got to be careful. But it's not impossible. It's not like super difficult to talk through. You've got an omnipotent deity who created a world that was the best of all possible worlds, because an all-good God would create the best of all possible worlds. That world has free will, because a world with free will is better than a world without. Free will leaves the possibility of love, because love depends on free will. It also leaves open the possibility of suffering and turning away from divinity, because free will means you get to do what you do. God's softly omnipotent, or fully omnipotent, save and except he doesn't get in the way of your free will. He created you with free will, and so that would mean that he gets the credit for it. And if that minimizes or modifies his omnipotence at all, that's a reasonable thing, because you got to balance being all good with all powerful. And so an all powerful deity that was also all good would give us free will. We misuse our free will. We're still dependent on God. Even in the misuse of our free will, we still require some kind of permission slip. And that permission slip is there in the law of karma, so you can't actually do anything you want. You can sort of do anything you want, but you can't do anything you want to any person, because Krishna has to match you up with people who deserve what they get, so they're not just being ruled by you, like as an independent deity, and you don't live in a truly chaotic world, and surrender to Krishna makes sense, and it's reasonable, an all-powerful deity could manage to match up the people who deserve to have stuff with them to the people who want to do the stuff to them, and then those people who did the stuff create their own karma, and those people who had stuff done to them are equalizing their karma. And you've got this incredibly complex algorithm at play, which an omnipotent deity would be able to execute, and an omniscient deity would know how to, like, what to do, and all good God would want to do that. It's like the fine art of closing the deity doors. No one knows how to do it. You teach a course on it or something like that. It was way too aggressive. The idea of karma as this law that you follow, and that's actually God's control over you, is totally consistent with an all-good deity. Because if there was no karma, you'd have no impetus to learn. And then you could argue that, well, if you have karma, then you have you don't have free will. But that's actually not true. You can get reactions to what you do, like with laws. You have laws, but the laws don't mitigate your free will. And, with the laws of an omnipotent deity, which includes omniscience, then there's no escaping. You get everything you deserve, and nothing more and nothing less. It seems compatible with free will. It does tilt the scale in favor of you making the right decision, because you get some ramifications for your action, but not so much so that you have no freedom to choose what you want to do. And so it works. You can explain it. It takes a few paragraphs. Takes a few pages, but you can tell a story and it all makes sense. Then you got to put that down on paper in philosophical language and be terse and use a minimum amount of verses. And what that ends up looking like is this panentheism, where God's everywhere and nowhere in all things, but at the same time aloof. Did you follow that? And then the result of such an understanding of divinity is that you become a devotee. You become devoted to Krishna. You turn towards Krishna. You use your free will to turn towards divinity. And then those people do kirtan and strive towards Krishna. So you got these two types of people that Krishna describes: the Mohini Prakriti Ashrita, people who take shelter of the illusory potency, and this Daivim Prakriti Ashrita, people who take shelter of the divine potency. And so you're left with this fundamental existential dilemma. What's his name? Bob Dylan is Jewish, but he converted to Protestant Christianity at some point. And he wrote a song called "You Gotta Serve Someone." It's very Christian-esque. It might be the devil, but it might be the Lord. Or it might be the Lord, but one thing's for sure: you gotta serve someone. And so this idea that we're going to turn towards Krishna in illusion, to not see divinity, but you still depend on Krishna for that, or you turn towards Krishna in surrender, and then you're dealing with Krishna directly. Instead of dealing with the laws, you're dealing with the lawmaker. Instead of the rules, you're dealing with the person. And so that's what happened in the first half of the 9th chapter. If we were going to not just go through the verses, but we were to try and do the themes that were messed with, that were fleshed out. You've got this weighty idea of panentheism, the example of the space and the wind, Krishna bouncing back and forth between owning material energy and saying he's aloof from it. He's Ut asina vati, seated as in if indifferently. But at the same time, it's swam prakriti, it's his prakriti. It's mayadhyakshena, he's overseeing that prakriti. Some people turn away from that, and they're mudhas, they're confused, and their vows and their understanding is all in vain. It doesn't work out. It's beguiled. And they take shelter of this illusory energy, but then devotees take shelter of the divine energy, and those devotees do kirtan and follow vows. That's the 9th chapter. We've been spending a few weeks on it, so you guys should all recognize them, even chronologically going through the verses sequentially. And then we get this one. Text 15. Others who engage in sacrifice by the cultivation of knowledge worship the Supreme Lord as one without a second, as diverse in many, and in the universal form. What does this mean? How is this related to the rest of the chapter? What does this mean? Others who engage in sacrifice by the cultivation of knowledge, they worship the Supreme Lord as one without a second, as diverse in many, and in the universal form. Let's look at the Sanskrit together. Jnana yagyena cha api anye. Others by jnana yagya. And others by jnana yagya. Yajantaha mam upasate. They worship me. They worship me in sacrifice, with sacrifices. They worship me upasate ekatvena. They worship me ekatva, in oneness, pritakvena, in variety, bahuda, many different types, by many different types, vishvata mukam, and with my face pointing everywhere. So these are the different things. Other people, by sacrifice of knowledge, they worship me in oneness, in difference, in many different ways, with my face pointing everywhere. There's a term Vishva Roop. It's used in the Gita. Vishva means every. It's the every form. It means God as the universe. And so Vishvata Mukha means like with a universal. The Mukha means face. So with like my face is pointing everywhere. And so it sounds very enigmatic, but the language actually is used in the Gita and also in other places to refer to this universal vision where you see the whole universe as being a cosmic person. And it goes back all the way to the Rig Veda, which has a prayer to the original person, where all the universes are contained within him, and all the social orders are contained within him, and it's very much like the idea of Ymir, the Norse frost giant that created the world, or Kronos, who was the father of the gods in Greek mythology. So there's this universe. The universe is created out of the body of the divine, and is fundamentally therefore divine, and that God is everywhere and in all things. But you envision it as a person, and then the rivers become his bodily fluids, and the mountains are his bones, and the trees are his hairs, and the upper, middle, and lower planetary systems are located in the three parts of his body: the lower, the midsection, of the upper. And the Brahmins are his head, and the Kshatriyas are his chest, or his arms, and the Vaishyas are his belly, and the Shudras are his legs, and all the social orders, and all the planetary systems, and everything which exists is seen as being part of the body of the divine. It's a meditation. It's what Arjuna will see in front of his eyes in a couple chapters. Others, they worship me with the sacrifice of knowledge. They worship me in oneness, in difference, in many ways, with a universal face. What does that mean?
That some people aren't ready to have a radical personal relationship with Krishna, but they do have some faith and sincerity and want to connect with something higher than themselves. And so in that way, they cultivate that relationship by looking at the divine in this way.
Did you hear him today? Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty minimalist what we can force on this verse. We know one thing. Krishna talked about people who turn away from God and people who turn towards him. And then there's this third category of people that aren't in the first two categories. So they're not bewildered people who turn away from divinity, who deny divinity, and they're not devotees who love Krishna. But they worship God in some way, and the way they worship God is indirect. They're others. It's not what Krishna just recommended in terms of being a devotee, but it's something else. And, there's in oneness, that kind of indicates this idea of an impersonal conception. If I had to guess, I think that's the best guess you can make. This energy that's everywhere, that everything participates in. And then as different, that gets into the various gods of polytheism, which is for sure the milieu of Hinduism that Krishna was speaking in. He's made reference to it previously in the Gita itself. And then Bahuda, many different ways. That kind of reminds me of the many different types of sacrifices that are done that Krishna speaks about. He speaks about people engaging in Bahuda yagna, many different types of yagyas, early in the second chapter of the Gita. And so that reminds me of that. Even the word yajante and yagna indicates there's some kind of Vedic ritual going on. And then this Vishvata Mukha I spent some time on because that one would be almost impossible just to guess. So you have to be aware that the language is used quite standardly to refer to this cosmic being. It seems like Krishna is referring to different types of spirituality, really different religions that existed around the same time that were not intensely devotional, but that were Vedic religions, and that were the religions of the Vedas that Krishna was commentating on, and that he was engaging with, and critiquing, and pacing, and outpacing. And so the Gita has this radical message of surrender to God that might not seem totally radical for somebody who was raised Christian or Catholic or even Jewish, but the idea is radical. It was radical when the Jews came up with it. They got enslaved and had to suffer. The Christians got, they had a hard go of it also. And so this idea that there's one source of everything and there's one place to hang your hat and there's just one thing you need to do. It's always been a radical idea. It doesn't sound radical to us because, at least from a lip service perspective, we've heard it. But when Christian cults start to actually try to do this stuff, they freak people out pretty quickly. Now, we looked at the verses that came before this, and they described, essentially a materialist or a non-devotee, and then a devotee, and then this third category, which has, 4 or 5 different possibilities of, different words: eka, oneness; pritak, duality; bahuda, many different; vishvata, mukha. And then you could also say the jnana yagya could be for all of them, or that could be yet another category, There's a bunch of different categories. Depending on how you want to parse the verse, you can interpret it variously. Are you guys following this? We're actually analyzing the text now. I'm not just talking to you. We're analyzing the text. So we have we have to contrast it with a devotee and with a straight materialist, and that's easy enough to do. That works. But then the subsequent texts, they sort of shine a light on what Krishna's trying to argue. But it is I who am the ritual, the sacrifice, the offering to the ancestors, the healing herb, the transcendental chant. I'm the butter and the fire and the offering. So that's interesting. Let's keep reading. This whole section deserves to be read and sequentially without interruption. So I'm going to start again, and we're going to go through maybe 4 or 5 verses. And I'm going to accentuate something Prabhupada adds in his translation. But it is I who am the ritual, I the sacrifice, the offering to the ancestors, the healing herb, the transcendental chant. I am the butter and the fire and the offering. I'm the father of this universe, the mother, the support, and the grandsire. I'm the object of knowledge, the purifier, and the syllable Om. I'm also the Rig, Sama, and Yajur Veda. I'm the goal, the sustainer, the master, the witness, the abode, the refuge, and the most dear friend. I'm the creation, the annihilation, the basis of everything, the resting place, and the eternal seed. I give heat. I withhold and send forth rain. I'm immortality. I'm death personified. Both spirit and matter are in me. Does anybody have any insight into what Krishna's doing here and how it's relevant to what we're looking at now, the verse we're trying to understand, and the weight of what Krishna's saying now subsequently, and how that, just as much as the previous verses, helps us to frame and interpret what Krishna's intending? Yep. Loud.
All the different ways that Krishna describes himself as Krishna is are all the different ways that those others, the different ways that those others worship God.
Yeah. We can interpret relatively easily these verses as clarifying something about the other people who worship the deity. I withhold and send forth rain. I'm heat and light, immortality, death. Those are all the traditional Vedic gods. So that does the, right? Then the whole yagna thing, I'm the ritual, I'm the this, I'm the that, that deals with the whole yagya culture. Right? And this whole of knowledge, but actually I'm the basis of everything, and I'm the mother and father and grandsire. So it's now when you're looking at this universal form, it's all personified in Krishna. You're still kind of not sure about this ekat vena, I'm cause and effect. That sounds a little bit like sort of an impersonal, oneness thing. Of course, there's also this oneness of trying to see the connectivity of everything. And so all these things that have just been listed are now all connected by being inhering within Krishna. And so he also, even like, feminine and masculine conceptions of divinity are dealt with. Different types of hierarchies and authorities are dealt with. We don't normally think about this, but when we say, like, why does a police officer have the authority to arrest you? Because of the law. Why does the law have authority over you? I don't actually know that you let it. Social contract theory has observed that you don't let the law rule over you. It just does. Yeah, M?
The Constitution?
The Constitution. Ultimately, it's the Constitution. There's local laws, state laws, but they're all subservient to the Constitution. Why does the Constitution have authority over us? Huh? I can't hear you.
We live here.
Because we live here? Sure, that's true. Other than that, just random, arbitrary, because we live here and it's just, that's what it is. And why does the Constitution have authority over us?
It's the founding document of a supposed legitimate government.
Okay, it's just totally arbitrary.
Protecting the freedom.
Yeah, you're not, don't try, Ravi Ji. You're not going to follow this one.
Is it because we believe it does?
No, because I have already, listen. Repeating what somebody else has said, and I already critiqued what they said, unless you can overcome that critique, all you're doing is making me give the same answer. I'm like, what's 2 plus 2? You're going to 3. And I'm like, no. And you're like, 3? I'm like, no. I'm like, 3? I'm like, no. Saying it again doesn't make it better. Here's why. The Constitution says it represents God's law. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equally. That means it's for everybody. And are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. The Constitution argues for its authority that it is framing out and putting down on paper the natural rights of man as ordained by God. The fundamental universal laws of any civilization. Now, any group could say that. And then you got to argue for why you are. And the Constitution, there's a document called the Rights of Man that was written a century before. And then actually the French Constitution is based on the U.S. Constitution. Benjamin Franklin had something to do with that. And then you've got the Republic by Plato, Socrates, where they lay this stuff out. And it's a long time tradition of trying to figure out what are the natural rights of mankind. What do you like? What is it? Should you have to retreat once you're in your home? Or if somebody comes into your home meaning to do you harm, are you allowed to stand your ground? That's castle law. Habeas corpus, producing the body. You can't just hold people without charging them. It's like a whole thing. There's all these rules, and a lot of them came up in the medieval period, and they're highly philosophical, and they're ultimately based on arguments for what the fundamental rights of a human being in this world as ordained by God. If we look at human beings, what is our basic rights? What are the inexorable rights of man that any just government has to back up? Do you follow? So obviously then we force you to do it, and we arbitrarily let people do it, and sometimes we don't, we rise up, and there were other rights of men that were the British Crown that we rose up against. And then we won, so we get to determine how it rolls. But even I'm the mother and the father, I'm death I'm the basis of all that exists. I'm the sun and the moon. It's like all the hierarchies and all the forces that exist within hierarchies. Krishna's saying those things all ultimately derive from him. So like when you get a ticket for parking in the red, it's because that's the Long Beach City Ordinance, which is based on, like LA County's laws, and which is based on the state laws of California, which is based on the federal laws, which is based on the Constitution, which is God's. You get it now? You get it now? It's like these local ordinances are participating in an argument for the universal law of God that's represented by our Constitution. And so, it's quite astounding what Krishna's doing here. He's saying, first of all, it's like all the Vedic yajna, that's all about me. Like your whole ritual cult, that's all just ultimately, like you just chant my name and that's it. You follow? That just took like all of Judaism and just like reduced all 613 mitzvahs to just you got to do Kirtan. That's a radical concept. And it's not like the Jews didn't do that themselves. There were the Essene Jews and the Nazarene Jews and all sorts of Jewish sects which came to the same type of conclusions and were actually like in an argument with groups like the Pharisees and the Orthodoxy. I mean, Jesus was essentially a rebel Jew as a rebellious Jew fighting against the ritual Jews of his time in the form of the Pharisees. And so, on one hand, you have this critique of the whole ritual culture and an attempt to link it all to God so that it's not seen as this vending machine where you just do the ritual and get the result, and whether or not God exists doesn't matter. There's a whole critique of the ridiculous ritualism of the Veda, which is a critique that Buddha made, by the way. It's a critique that Hinduism makes against itself. We're the loyal opposition. We critique our own text. You find the same thing, and you find actually the same thing is there in the Hebrew Bible. My belly is filled with burnt offerings. I will accept them no more. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. It's in the book of Hosea. Jesus quotes it. It's Hosea 6. Jesus himself quotes Hosea 6. And so even within Judaism, there were these voices against the ritual, against the sacrificial cult, trying to get the Jews to do something higher. So that happens. Then you have all these authority structures, mothers and fathers, all the way up to different gods. And now you're attacking like hierarchies and laws and also polytheism. You get this? Then there's this attempt to really create a universal form here. Krishna's saying all these things are me. And so that clarifies that. The universal form is elegantly standing right in front of Arjuna in a more loving, more embraceable form. And then, the whole jnana yajna, like this entire thing is knowledge of what's actually going on, seeing through the matrix and seeing what's actually going on. That whole Matrix movie is really based on the Rene Descartes' evil demon, which became the brain in the vat argument. BIV, brain in the vat. Rene Descartes argued that, what if there's just an evil demon that's just manipulating you, making you think that everything exists, but it doesn't. Where this became the brain in the vat argument. That's what it evolved into. And that's the Matrix. The whole movie was based on this brain in the vat idea. So what if your whole reality is a virtual reality and there's a whole other thing going on? And therefore, why trust anything you believe? It's an argument for just an absolute cynicism about the nature of fundamental reality as we know it. I have an argument against the brain in the vat, skeptic argument. For me to believe the brain in the vat argument, I have to believe everything I currently believe and then one extra additional unnecessary appendage. So why not just go with Occam's razor about the simpler reality, which is that I'm here and this is all real? Because the brain in the vat argument has to have everything that I believe and then add this one extra appendage to it. But why should I add one extra appendage for no good reason? And why would I not favor as superior the simpler argument? Did you follow that? Anyway. There's this real like seeing through the matrix of ritual and it's just this like one thing that you can know that you know everything. And then you get this oneness thing. And I guess there's no place where he directly attacks like impersonalism in this exact section. He does do it later on, indicating his familiarity with the impersonal conception of the absolute. But you don't find it right here. But you could say that you're looking for one thing that ties everything together, like everything's spiritual. You could say cause and effect. He says he's cause and effect. Sometimes that monistic theory is an attempt to describe both cause and effect in one simple language. Like matter is just energy. Everything is ultimately energy, including matter. And is that correct? Did I just gaff it there? Yeah, right? Thank you, yeah. All right, matter's in there somewhere. And it's not created or destroyed, it's just transformed. And matter is really just energy transformed into a particular state. And it's always in flux. And what we know as radioactivity or entropy is really just the disintegration of matter into simpler states. But nothing's really created or destroyed. So when he says he's both sat and asat, he's cause and effect. He's truth and untruth. But really, sat and asat means cause and effect. There's an attempt there to explain some kind of oneness or monism. With a Sankhya, you get into this dualistic system where there's matter and then there's energy, and those two things interact, and each one of them is a fundamental force. But by Krishna saying he's sat and asat, then he's saying he's both. Does that make sense? So if I was going to find the oneness, I would probably find it there. But it's you see in the later verses kind of a definition of what he must have meant in the previous verse. So we know it's not a devotee because they're others, is what he's describing. And then we know they're not atheists because they're still worshiping him. But then they're doing it in this indirect way. And Krishna's critiquing them for it. Because they missed the boat that it's all actually about him. Therefore, Prabhupada adds in that word but. Did you guys follow this? I would call this like an intermediate level discussion. Today, are you following this? Okay. Those who study the Veda and drink soma juice, seeking heavenly planets, worship me indirectly. It doesn't say that they worship me indirectly. Prabhupada added that in. It says they worship me, but it doesn't say that they worship me indirectly. It might be implied. Later on, Krishna says something. But anyway, in this particular verse, Prabhupada's throwing that in there. They worship me indirectly. Purified of sinful reactions, they take birth on the pious heavenly planet of Indra, where they enjoy godly delights. Indra gets mentioned here in the Gita for the one only time. When they have enjoyed, or at least for the first time, he might get mentioned in the 10th chapter. When they have thus enjoyed vast heavenly sense pleasure, I don't think so. I think it's the one time he gets mentioned. When they have thus enjoyed vast heavenly sense pleasure and the results of their pious activities are exhausted, they return to this mortal planet again. Those who seek sense enjoyment by adhering to the principles of the Vedas achieve only repeated birth and death. That's just a direct, massive attack on the Vedic ritual. on the culture of yajna. He already did it, but now he's doing it again. And he took the Soma Yajna, which was an entheogenic yajna where you took probably what was a Phaedra and you ritually purified it, and then you drank it, got intoxicated, went into battle. It's what the Aryans used to defeat the Dasyus in the Veda. The battle is actually described. And so it was a ritually prepared entheogenic drug, which I think was most probably ephedra, which does grow in the Central Asian plateaus and mountainous areas, which is where you get ephedrine from, so it's a stimulant. And there's all sorts of other theories about what it is, magic mushrooms, but taking magic mushrooms before you go ride in the battle, no. It's stupid. Nobody's going to do that. You know what I mean? It's like scholars who have never actually taken shrooms suggest such things. But nobody's actually taken mushrooms would ever take mushrooms and ride in the battle. Not the go. Then some people think it's ganja. And that, sometimes, it could work. It could work. But I don't think, especially drinking bong, sometimes, like some guys like to smoke weed and then wrestle. It's like a pastime, but I don't think there's kind of a sense in which you're kind of flowing. I don't think you'd want to have like an actual battle with swords and spears on horseback. And bong has a real, what do I want to say, a sedative-like effect. People go to sleep. So I don't think that's the go either. Ephedra seems like a good fit. Anyway, so he's critiquing this whole sacrificial cult that was like going on in the Veda directly. And his critique is very simple. Although you're purified, although you're pious, although you're engaging in ritual, ultimately it's materialistic and you come back down to this world and you don't actually transcend the world. And it's the same thing he said in the 8th chapter, so he's repeating himself at this point. But those who always worship me with exclusive devotion, meditating on my transcendental form, to them I carry what they lack and I preserve what they have. This is wild because now Krishna takes the entire Vedic yajna, and which was a heavy ritual. I mean, there was some guy who wanted to do like an Ashwamedha yajna, which is a horse sacrifice, some 100, 200 years ago, some rich guy. It's like thousands of animals you end up killing. It's like impossible to do. It takes such ridiculous amounts of wealth. You have to give so much charity. There's so much killing involved. The old Vedic cult involved the killing of animals. And within that old Vedic tradition, there was a group of people who weren't into killing animals. And that's our forefathers. And so rather than evolving out of it, we find those voices were there from the very beginning. Those voices that, were saying that the Vedic yajna was never meant to kill animals and was never meant to harm, and that there was a higher sacrifice. In fact, you see Krishna saying the same thing here. The Soma yajna didn't involve the death of animals. But yeah, you find this huge critique of this, big, ostentatious, pomp and circumstance ritual. And then Krishna says, if you just think about me, that's enough. If you just think about me, that's enough. To those who always worship me with exclusive devotion, meditating on my transcendental form, just as ananya chintayanto mam, those who think of me and nothing else. Ye jana parupasati, the people who worship me like that. Tesham nityabhiyuktanam, for those who are yoked to me like this. Yogakshemam vaham yaham, I carry them what they lack and I preserve what they have. So in contrast, you just have to think of Krishna rather than doing big, huge worship. Do you see the severity of the critique? It's really the rise of the doctrine of bhakti, devotion, loving God, and that being enough. What do you get for the person who has everything? You get your love, because nobody has everything. Your love is something you have that nobody has it unless you give it to them. Those who are devotees of other gods and who worship them with faith actually worship only me. That's a theme which has come up before, right? But they do it in the wrong way. Avidhi purvakam. They do it incorrectly. Remember how Prabhupada said they do it indirectly? Here it says that they're doing it incorrectly. So even this whole polytheistic culture, they're ultimately worshiping me, but they're doing it wrong. So it's not just like I'm all the other gods and therefore if you worship them, it's as good as worshiping me. And I'm the ritual and therefore if you do the ritual, it's as good as doing it for me. No, actually if you don't do it to me directly, and if you take those indirect routes, you don't get the same result and you're blowing it. You get it? Somebody could try to squeeze out, if I'm still worshiping Krishna and he's ultimately behind it, then I could do it this other way. Not according to this chapter. Not according to these verses. They don't give you that way out. When people are let's just do all the different chants to all let's chant for some Shiva a little bit, and we'll do a little chant for Ma. It's not if you follow the Gita, you can't do that. It's right here. You're doing it wrong. Ultimately they're coming from me, but it's the wrong way to do it. All this chanting, kirtan to other gods, it never existed. It's a neo-Hindu phenomenon. Let me say that one more time. There was no Shiva kirtan, no Kali kirtan. Didn't exist. There's folk music all over India, but that's not kirtan. Kirtan is that our religious practice, our way of communing with divinity, is to chant the name of God with musical accompaniment in order to achieve a divine rapturous state of union. It's our practice. You follow? The worshippers of the goddess never did that. The worshippers of Shiva never did that. Only the Vaishnavas did it. And now neo-Hindu movements in the last 100 years have started doing it. But let me say that again. If you're a Hindu chanting to all your different gods and goddesses, you've stolen our culture. And you've co-opted it. It's cultural appropriation. You follow? You stole our religious activity and you co-opted it and you use it in a way which is offensive to us, which goes against texts like the Gita. Did you follow that? Sorry. You don't find it. You don't find a culture of kirtan going back centuries, what to speak of millennium in these traditions. It's the Vaishnava practice. It comes from an idea that there's one supreme being and that you have an eternal relationship, and therefore you just cry out and grace will be bestowed upon you. It's very different than an impersonalist idea that ultimately you become one with the deity, and therefore devotion isn't really the go. You follow? Again, folk songs, mantras, incantations, but not chanting the name over and over again. That's the practice of the Vaishnavas. And neo-Hindus stole it and just swapped it out and put any name they wanted to in it. Does that make sense? But it's a FUBU situation. And it's for us, it's by us. It could just come in, some Johnny come lately, some neo-Hindu, steal our culture and do what you want with it and forget where it came from. You got to go ahead and put a footnote You got to admit what you're doing. And you got to confront the reality of the whole notion of kirtan, of crying out with abandon towards an all-good, all-powerful deity that loves you incomprehensibly. That's Vaishnavism. All the other groups that worship all the other deities don't think of Shiva or Durga as being like that, or Ganesh as being like that. They don't have that idea that there's one supreme entity. It's not that like some people worship Ganesh, and some people worship Shiva, and some people worship Durga, and some people worship Krishna. It's not like that. All these other groups are impersonalists or polytheists. The monotheists are the worshippers of Vishnu. There's a guy named Kshemaraj in the 13th century tried to say Shiva has an eternal planet where you'll go. His own people, his own Shaivas critiqued him and saying he was a fake Shaiva and he was just a Vaishnava replacing with Shaiva's name. They didn't even like it because they were actually knew their own philosophy, unlike these modern day neo-Hindu nonsense people. It must be like when Native Americans see people wearing their headdresses and stuff like that. It's like, you don't get to do that. Stop. You don't even know what you're doing. Like you throw on the headdress, you go do a luau. It's like you offend the Hawaiian people and you offend the Native Americans. It's just like what are you doing, I met a guy. This is late 80s, early 90s, right when I joined the Hare Krishnas. They had down by the LAX, they would have some New Age festival. All the freaks came out. And we would go there to distribute books, prasadam. But it was it was like actual people in tinfoil hats. Legitimately, all the freaks came out. And so I remember there was this one dude, long hair, and he was kind of yoked out. He was probably on steroids. But he looked a bit like Fabio. From those dime store novels. You look like he actually had some work done, back in the 80s. He had that kind of weird, Bruce Jenner kind of look to him, that pre-Caitlyn thing going on where he was just kind of wasn't quite sure what he was doing. He hadn't fully committed one way or the other. It was just kind of it was Michael Jackson kind of went down that road too. It just kind of got a little they couldn't quite figure out what was going on. And so he had a bit of that thing going on. And I stopped by the booth, and his thing was Native American, masculinity, and Buddhism. And I remember just chatting. I was 18. The guy was probably 40. I think he had a little bit of a harem going on too. I think that was also part of it. There's some kind of polyamory thing going on too. Like I said, it was really the freaks came out. So I got the polyamory thing and the Buddhist monk and the Native American thing, and some kind of masculine culture type thing going on. And I remember just dude, this is a total syncretism. Buddhism is so other. You can't mix that with the whole masculine culture and polyamory thing. That doesn't mix, dude. They're all celibate. Are you kidding me? Get your act together, dude. Learn the traditions. You can't just adopt a couple of the accoutrements of it. You get a little Tibetan, a Tibetan gong, you're rocking out on that, and you're also doing all this. It's not fair. The Dalai Lama would be ashamed of you, I think I remember telling him. And so maybe you can do the eclectic thing, but you got to actually learn the traditions and figure out if they can be put together or not. And if you're just cobbling them together and hoping nobody ever notices, it's a house of cards that just you touch it and it just falls apart. It's some kind of, what's that called, Sudoku or Jenko? What's the game where you play Jenko? It's some kind of fake game of Jenko. It's a house of cards. You think you're playing Jenko, but it's just a house of cards. You touch one of them, they all fall over. And so we own the night. The Vaishnavas, Kirtan is our thing. Kirtan is our thing. We even call it Sankirtan Yagna. Our Yagna is Kirtan. That language wasn't chosen haphazardly. It's there in the Bhagavatam. Yagyai Sankirtana Prayer Yajantahi Sumedha. The most intelligent people do the yagya of Sankirtan. And you find the same thing recommended here. Satatam Kirtayantamam. Always chant about me. And it's being contrasted to all these other things that existed. Krishna's a critic. He's critiquing like Hinduism as it existed during his time. That's what's going on. Just because Krishna's older than your grandma, you know? Just because you got brown skin and your grandma did this doesn't mean like you get to then, like you don't supersede Krishna. This is what the Gita teaches. You get it? This is comparative religion within our own tradition. And that's what the Gita is engaging in. And that's why we don't chant Kirtan of just any name. Like if I go to a Kirtan, I only go to Kirtan of Vaishnavas, but if I go to a Kirtan, if I was stuck on a plane, like there's some Ma Kirtan going on, something like that, I just, respectfully cover my ears and chant japa. Because here it is. I'm almost more laissez-faire about other religions. Because you guys get to define yourselves. But if you're in our family, participating and saying you follow our scriptures, now that there's a price that you pay for that. If you want to say you're following the Gita, well then you got to follow the Gita. Is this making sense? I am the only enjoyer and master of all sacrifices. Therefore, those who do not recognize my true transcendental nature fall down. Aham hi sava yagyanam bhokta cha prabhu evacha. I'm the only enjoyer and prabhu of all yagna. Natu mam abhijanati yavanyas chasmi tatvataha. Tatvenatas chavantite, excuse me. Those who don't understand this reality, that I'm actually at the top of the woodpile, that I'm the ultimate beneficiary, that it's all about me, that there's one supreme Lord above all things. People who don't get that, and if you were to say, I believe in the supreme Lord, I'm just going to call him Fred, I'm cool with that. I'm okay with that. Now you're just a different religion. But within the Hindu milieu, the worshippers of a supreme Lord were the Vaishnavas. That's just the name of that group. Aham hi sava yagam bhoktas cha prabhu eva cha natu mam abhijananti tatvenatas chavanti te. Those who don't know me in truth, like this, as this, they fall down. That I'm the only enjoyer and master of all sacrifice. It's a heavy point, and it's really like the cherry on top of the entire argument he just made for the last 10 verses. Why these people are others and they're not devotees, and what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong. Those who worship demigods will take birth amongst the demigods. Those who worship the ancestors go to the ancestors. And those who worship ghosts and spirits will take birth amongst such beings. And those who worship me will live with me. And they'll live with me forever. Krishna's already made this point. That his abode is abode beyond this material world that you don't come back from. And it's a singularity in that sense. If one offers me with love and devotion a leaf, a flower, a fruit, or water, I will accept it. You see again how simple it is. Well, we need some ritual, right? Okay, here's your ritual. And this segues nicely into temple worship. If you go to a Shiva or a Durga temple and you ask them, what happens when you achieve perfection? They'll say, you become one with everything. Or we're doing a ritual, but that's ultimately our theology. That's not bhakti. Our bhakti is, we're offering Krishna our love forever. And Krishna's reciprocating with it. Krishna's accepting it. Krishna's a person. You can embrace Krishna forever. You can dance with Krishna forever. You can serve Krishna forever. Krishna as a personal deity is forever. There's a supreme personal deity that's at the heart of the whole show. That's Vaishnavism. And a rose by any other name smells just as sweet. The Jews figured this out. The Christians kept it alive. The Muslims understand this. All the great religions of the world understand this point. Actually, to be honest, I think most people who participate in those traditions are pre-theistic. I don't think they actually understand this point. I find it's a bizarre thing in Western religion where they'll say impersonal stuff like become the Christ and stuff like that. And like you're like, and you think it's cool. And like you're like, do you realize you just threw your whole thing in the garbage can? There's actually no language in English to designate between people who worship a personal deity and people who worship an impersonal deity. Like we have, there's monists and dualists, and you know what I mean? And polytheists, and monotheists, and henotheists, and kathenotheists, and panentheists, and pantheists, and deists, and animists. There's all these different terms, but there is no term to designate those who worship a personal and an impersonal conception of divinity. Sometimes you'll say monist, but I'm a monist. I believe everything comes from Krishna. But my monist ideal is a person. You follow? The source of everything is innately personal, fundamentally personal, irreducibly personal. That's Krishna. So I'm also a monist. But I'm a variegated monist, where I believe there's variety within the absolute. There's personality within the absolute. There is no language in English, in Western philosophy, that simply designates this. You have to spend a couple of paragraphs to make the point. Which is just like profoundly ignorant. It's like a massive blind spot in all of Western philosophy and theology. It's like a surgeon leaving a rag inside the person. It's like so bad. You're almost like, do you guys even believe in God? Like what's wrong with you? You haven't thought this stuff through and come up with a language for discussing it. There's more, but there's a nice break point for us. Thank you for IGTV. Thank you for joining us. If you guys want to hang on Facebook and Zoom for a minute, we'll have a